The heavy oak doors of Sterling Enterprises were supposed to be the gateway to Clara's legacy, the very empire she had built from the ground up alongside her husband. But at 7 months pregnant, carrying the heir to Arthur's sprawling real estate fortune, those doors opened to a living nightmare. There, behind the massive mahogany desk, sat a younger woman not just in Clara's office, but swiveling lazily in her custom-designed Italian leather chair. The stranger was casually sipping from Clara's favorite mug, wearing a silk blouse unbuttoned just enough to reveal a very familiar, sparkling diamond pendant. The ultimate betrayal wasn't just happening behind her back, it was sitting directly on her throne. For 7 years, Clara and Arthur Sterling were the golden couple of Chicago's luxury real estate market. They were a powerhouse duo. Arthur had the ruthless charisma for acquisitions, and Clara possessed the brilliant architectural vision that turned dilapidated warehouses into multi-million-dollar loft spaces. Together, they had transformed a modest startup into Sterling Enterprises, a firm worth over $300 million. But success has a funny way of changing the acoustics of a marriage. As the bank accounts swelled, the conversations in their sprawling Gold Coast penthouse grew sparse, echoing off the imported Italian marble floors. The distance between them hadn't happened overnight. It began subtly, creeping in around the time Clara discovered she was pregnant. It was a miracle baby. After 3 heartbreaking miscarriages and endless rounds of grueling IVF treatments, the positive test had been a moment of tearful, desperate joy. Clara had immediately stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the firm, officially going on maternity leave to prioritize her health and the safety of her unborn son. Arthur had insisted on it. "You've given this company everything, Clara," he had told her, holding her hands in his. "Let me handle the boardrooms. You just focus on our boy." At first, his words felt like a warm blanket of security. But by her 2nd trimester, that blanket began to feel like a suffocating blindfold. Arthur's hours at the office stretched longer and longer. He blamed the aggressive expansion into the commercial sector, citing endless zoning meetings and late-night negotiations with international investors. Clara, battling severe morning sickness and exhaustion, wanted to believe him. She chose to believe him, but a woman's intuition, sharpened by the protective instincts of impending motherhood, is a difficult alarm to silence. The first tangible red flag appeared on a rainy Tuesday in early October. Arthur had come home at 2 in the morning, slipping into bed with the stealth of a thief. When Clara woke up to adjust her pregnancy pillow, she caught a whiff of his suit jacket draped over the velvet armchair. It wasn't the sharp, familiar scent of Tom Ford vetiver and expensive scotch. It was a cloying, expensive mixture of vanilla, amber, and something distinctly floral. It was the scent of another woman's perfume, layered thickly over his collar. When confronted the next morning over coffee, Arthur hadn't even flinched. His lie was as smooth as his tailored suits. "It was a networking gala for the new waterfront project, Clara. I was trapped in an elevator with the PR team for 20 minutes. You know how those marketing girls drown themselves in Chanel. You're overthinking, sweetheart. The hormones are making you anxious." He kissed her forehead, leaving a cold trail of dread in his wake. The gaslighting was subtle, but effective. He made her feel crazy for asking. Then came the mysterious expenses. Clara, despite her leave of absence, was still officially the co-founder and retained access to the executive accounts. Late one evening, while organizing files for the nursery, she noticed a peculiar charge on the corporate American Express, $42,000 at a high-end boutique jeweler in Manhattan. When she asked Arthur about it, he smiled warmly, his raw eyes crinkling at the corner. "You ruined the surprise, Clara. It's your push present. I'm having something custom-made for you for when the baby arrives. Please, don't look at the accounts anymore. Let me spoil you." She had felt a pang of guilt for doubting him. He was building an empire for their family, and here she was, playing detective. But the final straw, the one that finally broke the dam of Clara's denial, happened the night of their 7th wedding anniversary. Arthur had cancelled their reservations at La Bernardin at the last minute, claiming a catastrophic plumbing failure at their flagship development required his immediate on-site presence. He promised to make it up to her, swearing he would be home by midnight. Clara had stayed up, watching the city lights flicker outside their floor-to-ceiling windows, her hand resting over her swollen belly. Midnight came and went. At 3 a.m, Arthur's iPad sent to his personal phone and left carelessly on the kitchen island. Chime. Clara shouldn't have looked, but she did. A message illuminated the dark kitchen. The sheets here are almost as soft as you. See you tomorrow, boss. This. Clara's heart stopped. The air vanished from her lungs. She spent the next 4 hours sitting in the dark, her mind racing through the roster of employees at Sterling Enterprises. There was a new vice president of acquisitions, hired just 3 months ago after Clara went on leave. Her name was Vanessa Kensington, a former model turned ruthless corporate shark, known for her sharp pencil skirts and even sharper ambition. Clara didn't cry. The time for tears had passed with the miscarriages. Instead, a cold, absolute clarity washed over her. Arthur thought she was just a fragile hormonal incubator tucked safely away in their ivory tower. He had forgotten that. Before she was his wife, she was his equal. She was the architect. She knew where every load-bearing wall in their company was located, and she knew exactly how to tear the building down. The following Thursday afternoon, Clara decided it was time to visit the office. She didn't call ahead. She dressed impeccably, choosing a tailored emerald green maternity dress that highlighted her bump while projecting an aura of absolute authority. She slipped her access keycard, the one Arthur assumed she had lost months ago, into her designer handbag. When Clara's town car pulled up to the sleek, glass-fronted skyscraper of Sterling Enterprises, the air was crackling with a strange, heavy tension. As she walked through the revolving doors into the lobby, the low hum of corporate chatter instantly died. Security guards, who usually offered her warm smiles and friendly banter, suddenly looked panicked. David, the burly head of security, practically tripped over his own boots rushing over to her. Mrs. Sterling. Clara, we didn't know you were coming in today, David stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the private elevator bank. Mr. Sterling is in a very important closed-door meeting right now. It's fine, David. I'm not here to interrupt Arthur's meeting, Clara said, her voice smooth as silk, though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I just need to grab some old architectural blueprints from my office. The baby's nursery needs a redesign. Before David could protest further, Clara bypassed him, swiping her MasterCard at the VIP elevator. The doors slid shut on David's horrified face. The ride up to the 45th floor executive suite felt like an eternity. With every passing floor, Clara's resolve hardened. When the elevator dinged and the doors parted, she stepped onto the plush carpets of the executive wing. Beatrice, Arthur's loyal assistant of 5 years, was at her desk. When she saw Clara, the poor woman dropped the stack of files she was holding. The papers scattered across the floor like dry leaves. Mrs. Sterling, Beatrice gasped, her face draining of all color. She scrambled out from behind her desk, physically attempting to block the hallway leading to Clara's private office. You shouldn't be here. I mean, let me call Arthur. He's in the conference room, I can just. Beatrice, step aside, Clara commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of the woman who signed Beatrice's paychecks. Clara, please, Beatrice whispered, tears springing to her eyes, her loyalty tearing her apart in real time. Don't go in there. Just let me get Arthur. If you don't move, Beatrice, I will fire you before my foot hits the ground, Clara said quietly. Defeated and trembling, Beatrice stepped back. Clara walked down the corridor. Her office, the one she had painstakingly designed with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, was at the very end. The door was slightly ajar. Clara pushed it open, her hand resting protectively over her unborn child. The breath was violently knocked out of her. There, behind the massive oak desk that Clara had bought at an auction in Paris, sat Vanessa Kensington. But she wasn't just sitting. She was completely at home. Vanessa had her bare feet kicked up on the polished wood. She was wearing a crisp white button-down shirt, Arthur's shirt grossly oversized on her petite frame. Worse than the shirt, worse than the bare feet on her desk, was where Vanessa was sitting. She was lounging in Clara's custom-designed ergonomic leather chair, the chair Clara had specially ordered for her back pain during her earlier pregnancies. Vanessa was lazily scrolling through her phone, sipping an iced latte from a mug that said, "World's Best Architect," a joke gift Arthur had given Clara 5 years ago. And resting perfectly against Vanessa's exposed collarbone, glinting in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, was a spectacular, heavy diamond pendant. The $42,000 push present. Clara stood in the doorway, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the scene. The betrayal was so profound, so vividly insulting, that it briefly transcended pain and moved straight into a surreal kind of comedy. Vanessa finally looked up from her phone. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed across her manicured features, but it was quickly replaced by a smug, insolent smirk. She didn't scramble to her feet. She didn't apologize. Instead, she slowly lowered her legs from the desk and leaned back into the leather chair, letting it squeak loudly in the silent room. "Well," Vanessa purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "If it isn't the phantom co-founder, Clara, right? I'd stand up to greet you, but honestly, I'd had a very exhausting morning with Arthur." Clara took a step into the room, her high heels kicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "Get out of my chair." Vanessa laughed, a high, grating sound. She reached up, her manicured fingers playing with the heavy diamond pendant resting on her chest. "Your chair. Oh, honey. You've been gone a long time. Arthur had this office completely repurposed. I needed a space with good natural light for the new acquisition contracts. It's my office now." "You are wearing my husband's shirt," Clara stated, her voice dangerously even, ignoring the bait. "And you are wearing the necklace he bought with my company credit card. I suggest you take both of them off before I call security and have you dragged out onto the pavement." Vanessa's smirk faltered slightly, but she doubled down. She stood up, leaning her hands on the desk, locking eyes with Clara's. "You really don't get it, do you? You're a breeding mare, Clara. Arthur loves you like he loves an old, comfortable couch. But I'm the one helping him run this empire now. I'm the one he takes to the gallows. I'm the one he actually wants." Before Clara could unleash the fury boiling in her veins, the heavy double doors behind her burst open. Arthur stood in the doorway, breathless, his tie undone, his face a mask of absolute, paralyzing terror. He looked from his pregnant wife, standing rigid with fury, to his mistress, draped in his clothes and his money. "Clara?" Arthur choked out, the color completely gone from his face. "Clara, please, I can explain." Clara didn't look at her husband. She kept her eyes locked on Vanessa's pale face. "There's nothing to explain, Arthur," Clara said softly, a terrifying calm smile spreading across her lips. "Because as of right now, I am freezing all company assets, initiating a forensic audit, and filing for divorce." "And Vanessa?" Clara finally turned her head, looking at the man who had just destroyed his own life. "Vanessa is fired." The silence that followed Clara's declaration was absolute. broken only by the faint, distant wail of a police siren on the Chicago streets far below. Arthur stared at his wife as if she had suddenly sprouted wings and breathed fire. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving his perennial California tan looking sallow and sickly. "Fired?" Vanessa broke the silence, her initial shock morphing into a harsh, defensive scoff. She crossed her arms, pulling Arthur's oversized shirt tighter across her chest. "You can't fire me. You've been on maternity leave for 6 months. You don't even know the current organizational structure, Clara. Arthur is the CEO. Clara didn't even blink." She slowly turned her gaze back to the younger woman, her expression a mask of terrifying composure. "Arthur is the chief executive officer, yes. I am the president, the co-founder, and a 51% majority shareholder. I structured it that way 7 years ago, because I provided the initial seed capital from my late father's estate. Arthur might sign your checks, Vanessa, but I own the bank." Arthur swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He took a hesitant step toward Clara, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Clara, sweetheart, let's just go home. We can talk about this. You're upset, you're pregnant, your blood pressure. Do not weaponize my pregnancy to cover your infidelity, Arthur," Clara snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. The sudden volume made both Arthur and Vanessa flinch. "And do not dare call me sweetheart. My lawyer, Margaret St. James, will be in contact by 5 o'clock this evening. I suggest you find representation." "And Vanessa?" Clara leaned slightly over the desk, her emerald green dress brushing the polished oak. "I want security to escort you out of this building in exactly 15 minutes. Leave the necklace on the desk. It's company property." "Arthur!" Vanessa shrieked, finally dropping the cool girl facade. She turned to the man she had been sleeping with, expecting him to defend her, to assert his dominance. But Arthur was paralyzed. He knew Clara was right about the shares. He knew Margaret St. James was the most vicious, bloodthirsty divorce attorney in the state of Illinois, a woman who ate philandering billionaires for breakfast. "Vanessa, just do as she says," Arthur whispered, running a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Just leave the necklace and go." Vanessa's jaw dropped. The betrayal in her eyes was almost poetic, but Clara felt no pity. The younger woman furiously unclasped the heavy diamond pendant, throwing it onto the oak desk with a loud clatter. She grabbed a designer purse and stormed past Clara, purposely bumping her shoulder as she exited. Clara stood perfectly still until the heavy doors clicked shut behind Vanessa. She then turned her attention to her husband, who was currently looking at the floor like a scolded child. "I am going to the penthouse to pack my things," Clara said, her voice dropping back to that terrifying, icy calm. "You will not be there. In fact, you will not come within 50 feet of me until my legal team says otherwise. Do you understand? Clara, please. I love you. It was a mistake." "She meant nothing," Arthur begged, tears finally welling in his blue eyes. "If she meant nothing, Arthur, then you just threw away everything for nothing," Clara replied. She turned on her heel and walked out of the office she had built, leaving her husband standing alone in the ruins of his own making. By the time Clara's town car arrived at the Gold Coast penthouse, her tears had finally come. But they weren't tears of heartbreak. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched through the sprawling, multi-million-dollar apartment, instructing her loyal housekeeper Maria to help her pack. At 4:45 p.m., exactly 15 minutes before Margaret St. James was scheduled to serve Arthur, Clara sat at the marble kitchen island, with her laptop open. She logged into the corporate banking portal. Because Arthur handled the daily operations, he assumed Clara never checked the back-end finances. He was wrong. With a few swift keystrokes and her master authorization codes, Clara initiated a Code Red protocol of failsafe they had designed years ago to protect the company from hostile takeovers or sudden financial hemorrhaging. It immediately froze all discretionary spending, halted all outbound wire transfers over $5,000, and temporarily suspended all corporate credit cards issued to executive staff, including Arthur's, at exactly 5:15 p.m., as Clara was checking into a private, ultra-secure suite at the Peninsula Hotel under an alias. Her phone buzzed. It was an automated alert from American Express. Transaction declined. $12,500 at the Four Seasons. Guest, Arthur Sterling. Clara allowed herself a small, bitter smile. Arthur had tried to check into a luxury hotel to lick his wounds, likely expecting to charge it to the company dime. Welcome to the real world, Arthur. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Operating from her suite at the Peninsula, Clara transformed her grief into a highly organized, weaponized machine. Margaret's and James, a silver-haired shark in Armani suits, practically moved into the adjoining room, flanked by a team of elite forensic accountants led by a quiet, brilliant man named Simon. Arthur, meanwhile, was unraveling. Cut off from the corporate slush funds and terrified of Clara's majority shareholder status, he had attempted to rally the board of directors against her. He claimed Clara's pregnancy had caused a mental break, insisting she was actively destroying the firm's stability. But Clara was 10 steps ahead. Before Arthur could even schedule an emergency board meeting, Clara had personally messaged every single board member. She didn't send them emotional pleas, she sent them raw data. She sent them screenshots of the frozen accounts, and she promised a full, transparent audit. The board, composed of ruthless investors who cared only about the bottom line, immediately sided with the money. They told Arthur to sit down and shut up until the audit was complete. Late one Tuesday night, as Clara was resting on a velvet sofa with a heating pad against her aching back, Simon knocked gently on the connecting door. "Come in, Simon," Clara called out, sitting up and adjusting her robe. Simon walked in, clutching a thick manila folder. His usually stoic face looked grim. Margaret followed closely behind him, her sharp eyes fixed on Clara. "We found something, Clara," Margaret said, bypassing the pleasantries. She sat in the armchair opposite Clara, crossing her legs. "And it's worse than we thought." "Much worse." Clara braced herself, resting a protective hand over her baby bump. "Show me." Simon opened the folder and spread a series of highlighted bank statements, wire transfers, and property deeds across the glass coffee table. "When you froze the accounts, Arthur panicked," Simon explained, adjusting his glasses. "He started trying to move money out of his personal checking into an offshore account in the Caymans. We flagged it immediately, but that led us to dig deeper into the commercial acquisitions he made over the last 8 months, specifically during the time you were on maternity leave." Simon pointed to a property deed for a massive, abandoned textile warehouse in the trendy West Loop district. Sterling Enterprises purchased this property 6 months ago for $12 million. The plan was to convert it into luxury lofts, correct? "Yes," Clara nodded. "I drew the preliminary sketches for it myself before I stepped back. It was supposed to be our flagship project for next year." "Well," Simon said softly, "Sterling Enterprises didn't buy it. A holding company called VK Holdings LLC bought it, using Sterling Enterprises' money." Clara frowned, her mind racing. VK Holdings? The realization hit her like a physical blow. The air rushed out of the room. Vanessa Kensington, Margaret, nodded grimly. "Arthur didn't just buy his mistress a $40,000 necklace, Clara. He used corporate funds, $12 million of your company's money, to secretly buy a prime piece of real estate under her name. He was embezzling from his own company, effectively stealing from you, the board, and your future child to set up a shadow empire with his girlfriend." Clara stared at the documents, the numbers blurring together as a sickening wave of betrayal washed over her. The affair was a knife to the heart. This was a knife to the back, twisted violently. Arthur was planning to leave her. He had been quietly siphoning off their shared wealth, building a golden parachute for himself and Vanessa, waiting for the perfect moment to blindside Clara, likely right after the baby was born. "He's a fool," Clara whispered, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with a cold, terrifying fury. "It's corporate fraud, Clara," Margaret said, her voice practically purring with the thrill of the legal kill. "It's grand larceny. It violates his fiduciary duty to the board. We don't just have him for divorce anymore. We have him for criminal embezzlement. We can destroy him completely." "Do it," Clara said without hesitation. She looked up, her eyes hard and glittering like cut diamonds. "I want the board notified tomorrow morning. I want civil suits filed against both Arthur and Vanessa. I want her assets frozen. I want everything." The trap was set. But Arthur, desperate and backed into a corner, was about to make the biggest, most dangerous mistake of his life. 2 days later, Clara had a mandatory ultrasound appointment at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. It was the one place her security detail, David, who had formally resigned from Sterling Enterprises to work exclusively for Clara, couldn't stand directly inside the room. As Clara walked out of the clinic, clutching the printed sonogram photos of her son, a firm hand clamped down on her upper arm, yanking her hard into a secluded stairwell. Clara gasped, dropping her purse. She looked up into the bloodshot, manic eyes of her husband. Arthur looked like a ghost of the man he once was. His suit was wrinkled, he smelled faintly of stale whiskey, and his hands were shaking violently. "You cancel the audit, Clara," Arthur hissed, his fingers digging painfully into her arm, his face inches from hers. "You call off your attack dog lawyer, and you unfreeze my accounts right now." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground, refusing to show him the fear he desperately wanted to see. "Let go of me, Arthur, or I will scream." "You don't understand what you're doing," Arthur practically spat, his voice echoing in the concrete stairwell. "I owe people money, Clara. Real, dangerous people. The $12 million wasn't just for Vanessa. It was collateral for a bridge loan I took out to cover bad investments I made before you went on leave. If you expose VK Holdings, I go to prison, and those investors will come after everything." Clara stared at him, the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. He wasn't just a cheater. He wasn't just a thief. He was a colossal failure who had leveraged their entire empire on a secret gamble, and Vanessa was just the naive pawn he used to hide the paper trail. Before Clara could respond, the stairwell door burst open with a deafening crash. David, a head of security, filled the doorframe, his hand resting menacingly on the taser at his hip. "Step away from my client, mister." "Sterling," David growled, his voice low and dangerous, "or I'll drop you right here on the concrete." Arthur froze, his grip on Clara's arm loosening. He looked at David, then back to Clara, sheer panic overriding his brief surge of aggression. He stumbled backward, his hands raised in surrender. Clara smoothed down the sleeve of her maternity coat, her heart racing, but her posture unbroken. She picked up her fallen sonogram photos from the dusty floor, clutching them tightly to her chest. "You're right, Arthur," Clara said quietly, her voice echoing with finality in the cold stairwell. "I don't understand what I'm doing, because what I'm doing is no longer just a divorce. It's an extermination." The adrenaline crash hit Clara the moment the heavy doors of her armored tan car slammed shut. She slumped against the plush leather seats, her trembling hands resting protectively over her stomach. David, sitting in the driver's seat, adjusted the rearview mirror to catch her eye. He didn't offer empty platitudes or ask if she was okay. He simply locked the doors, engaged the privacy partition, and pulled out into the chaotic Chicago traffic. "Take me to Margaret's office, David," Clara instructed, her voice raspy but resolute. "Arthur has escalated. We need to drop the hammer before he does something completely unhinged. Within the hour, Clara was sitting in the ultra-modern, glass-walled conference room of St. D. James and Associates. Margaret listened intently as Clara recounted the stairwell ambush, a silver pen tapping a rhythmic, deadly beat against her legal pad. Bridge loans, Margaret mused, a predatory gleam in her eye. Arthur was always a gambler, but leveraging $12 million of corporate capital to cover private high-risk debt that crosses the line from foolishness into federal jurisdiction. He mentioned dangerous people, Clara said, taking a sip of the herbal tea Margaret's paralegal had provided. Who exactly would loan Arthur that kind of money without my signature as the majority shareholder? Simon, the forensic accountant who had been summoned immediately, pushed his glasses up his nose. He had his laptop open, his fingers flying across the keys. I've been tracking the wire transfers associated with the warehouse purchase. The money didn't just sit in VK Holdings. A substantial portion of it was immediately used as collateral for a massive line of credit issued by a private equity firm called Ironclad Capital. Margaret whistled low. Ironclad. They aren't traditional bank, Clara. They operate in the shadow banking sector. They provide mezzanine financing and predatory bridge loans to developers who are too toxic for Wall Street. Their CEO, Silas Croft, is notorious for hostile takeovers. If a developer defaults, Croft doesn't just sue them. He seizes their assets, guts their companies, and sells the scraps. Arthur defaulted on whatever shadow investments he made, and he used the warehouse bought with my money to keep Silas Croft from breaking his legs. Clara deduced, the sheer magnitude of her husband's stupidity leaving her breathless. Exactly, Simon nodded. And because VK Holdings technically holds the deed to the warehouse, Croft believes he has a legitimate claim to a $12 million asset. Not if we prove VK Holdings is a shell company funded by embezzled corporate capital, Margaret interjected smoothly. However, Croft won't go down without a fight. You will tie Sterling Enterprises up in litigation for years, draining your resources. Clara stood up, pacing the length of the conference room. Her back ached, and her son kicked violently against her ribs, as if sensing his mother's agitation. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Chicago skyline, the skyline she had helped shape. Arthur had nearly burned it all down for a bruised ego and a cheap affair. Set up a meeting with Silas Croft, Clara commanded, turning back to her team. For tomorrow morning, Margaret blinked. Clara, Croft is a shark. He eats blood for breakfast. Let me handle him. No, Clara said softly, her eyes hardening into shards of green ice. Arthur spent the last 6 months convincing the world, and probably Silas Croft, that I was just a hormonal housewife out of the picture. It's time Mr. Croft meets the actual architect of Sterling Enterprises. The next morning, the boardroom at the Peninsula Hotel was chilled to exactly 68 degrees. Clara sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by Margaret and David. At exactly 9 a.m., the doors opened and Silas Croft walked in. He was a broad-shouldered man in a bespoke charcoal suit possessing the cold, dead eyes of a great white Shah. He was accompanied by 2 massive men who looked less like lawyers and more like hired muscle. Croft took a seat opposite Clara, not bothering to offer a handshake. He looked at her swollen belly, then up to her face, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. Mrs. Sterling, Croft began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I must admit, I was expecting your husband, or at least a panic attack and a checkbook. I understand Arthur has made a mess of things. Arthur is no longer authorized to speak on behalf of Sterling Enterprises, nor does he have access to its capital, Clara said, leaning forward slightly. I am the majority shareholder, and I'm here to discuss the fraudulent collateral he offered you. Croft's smirk vanished. The West Loop warehouse is legally deeded to VK Holdings. Arthur pledged that asset to me. The debt is due, If he doesn't pay, Ironclad takes the property. It's very simple, Mrs. Sterling. Your marital squabbles are not my concern. Clara slid a thick, bound dossier across the polished table. Croft didn't touch it, but his eyes darted to the cover. What you hold, Mr. Croft, is a comprehensive geological and architectural survey of the West Loop warehouse, Clara said, her voice dripping with absolute authority. I drew the blueprints for its renovation myself. What Arthur didn't know, because he doesn't bother to read the engineering reports, is that the warehouse sits on a Grade 4 environmentally protected watershed. The foundation is laced with black mold and asbestos. Croft's brow furrowed. What is your point? My point, Clara smiled, is that without my specific patented architectural mitigation plans and the $3 million in environmental zoning permits that only Sterling Enterprises has the municipal pull to expedite, that warehouse is entirely undevelopable. It is a toxic, worthless brick shell. If you seize it, you aren't getting $12 million of real estate. You are inheriting a multi-million-dollar environmental cleanup liability that the city of Chicago will fine you for daily. Croft stared at her, the silence in the room stretching until it was almost deafening. He finally opened the dossier, his eyes scanning the heavily stamped engineering reports and municipal zoning codes. You're bluffing, Croft muttered, though the confidence had entirely leaked from his voice. I am an architect, Mr. Croft. I build things, and I know exactly how they crumble, Clara replied coolly. If you try to take that property, Margaret will tie you up in federal court, proving the funds were embezzled, while the city bleeds Ironclad capital dry for environmental violations. Croft closed the folder. What do you want, Mrs. Sterling? I want Ironclad Capital to release its lien on VK Holdings and the warehouse, Clara demanded. In exchange, I will not report your predatory loan practices to the SEC. Furthermore, I will hand over Arthur's personal portfolio, his vintage car collection, his private equity stocks, and the deed to his Aspen ski lodge. It covers 80% of what he owes you. You will take the haircut on the remaining 20%, and you will leave my company alone. Croft looked at Margaret, who offered him a terrifying, bloodthirsty smile, and then back at Clara. He recognized an apex predator when he saw one. Deal, Croft growled, standing up. But I pity your husband, Mrs. Sterling. He has absolutely no idea what he's dealing with. No, Clara agreed quietly. He doesn't. While Clara was securing the empire, Vanessa Kensington was discovering the brutal reality of being a mistress to a fallen king. Vanessa's morning began at the Chanel boutique on Oak Street. She had selected a pair of lambskin boots to soothe her bruised ego after the humiliating eviction from Clara's office. But when she handed the cashier her black American Express card, the one Arthur had given her, the machine beeped angrily. Declined. Frowning, Vanessa handed over her personal debit card. Declined. Panic fluttering in her chest, Vanessa stepped out onto the sidewalk and pulled up her banking app. A bright red banner flashed across her screen. AEC Cantron Fersen, pending legal investigation. Before she could even process the horror, a phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hello? She answered, her voice shaking. Miss Kensington? A smooth, authoritative female voice said. This is Margaret St. James. I represent Clara Sterling. I'm calling to inform you that a civil suit for corporate espionage, grand larceny, and embezzlement has just been filed against you in civil court. Furthermore, we have handed over the financial records of VK Holdings to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. FBI? Vanessa gasps, dropping her Chanel shopping bag onto the dirty pavement. No, you don't understand. Arthur gave me that company. He said it was a tax shelter. Ignorance is not a defense against federal fraud, Ms. Kensington, Margaret replied seamlessly. You signed the deeds. You wore the jewelry bought with stolen funds. You are an accessory. You are looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary." Vanessa burst into tears right there on Oak Street. "Please, I didn't know he was stealing from his own company." "I don't want to go to jail." Margaret paused, letting the silence amplify Vanessa's terror. "There is one alternative. Be at my office in 20 minutes. Do not call Arthur. If you dial his number, the deal is off the table." 45 minutes later, Vanessa was sitting in Margaret's office, mascara running down her pale cheeks. She sang like a canary. She handed over her phone, granting Simon full access to her text threads, encrypted emails, and voice memos. She provided the physical evidence that proved Arthur had masterminded the entire VK Holdings show corporation, deliberately hiding the transactions from the board and Clara. Vanessa traded the man she thought she loved for federal immunity. Meanwhile, Arthur was unraveling at a terrifying speed. He had been kicked out of his secondary hotel, and the credit cards declined. He had tried to call Silas Croft to beg for an extension, but Croft's number had been disconnected. He tried to call Vanessa, but it went straight to voicemail. His entire world, built on lies and stolen money, was evaporating. Desperate, unwashed, and running on pure panic, Arthur hailed a cab to the West Loop warehouse. He knew there were physical copies of the original loan documents from Ironclad Capital hidden in a safe in the psych manager's trailer. If he could get those documents and destroy them, maybe he could convince the board this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe he could spin a lie that Vanessa acted alone. He arrived at the sprawling, dilapidated warehouse just as the sun was setting, casting long, ominous shadows across the crumbling brickwork. He jimmied the lock on the chain-link fence and sprinted toward the rusted metal trailer, sitting in the center of the dusty lot. He burst into the trailer, tearing through filing cabinets, throwing papers to the floor in a manic frenzy. "Where are they? Where are they?" he screamed to the empty room. Suddenly, the area outside the trailer was flooded with blinding, piercing white light. "Arthur Sterling!" a voice boomed through a megaphone, rattling the thin metal walls of the trailer. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Step outside with your hands above your head." Arthur froze, a file folder slipping from his trembling fingers. He peered through the grimy window. 5 black SUVs surrounded the trailer. Red and blue lights pulsed rhythmically, illuminating the dust in the air. Armed federal agents were advancing, their weapons drawn. It was over. At that exact moment, 5 miles away in the penthouse of the Peninsula Hotel, Clara gasped, dropping the pen she was using to sign the final divorce decree. A sharp, agonizing pain ripped through her lower abdomen, entirely different from the dull ache she had been experiencing for weeks. It felt like a rubber band snapping violently inside her, followed by a warm rush of fluid down her legs. Margaret, who had been reviewing the paperwork, looked up in alarm. "Clara?" Clara gripped the edge of the glass table, her knuckles turning white as a contraction seized her body with terrifying force. She looked down at the puddle forming on the Persian rug. "Margaret!" Clara breathed out, her chest heaving as she tried to ride the wave of pain. "My water just broke." "It's too early. I'm only 34 weeks. "David!" Margaret shrieked, entirely dropping her icy lawyer persona. The security guard burst into the room, taking one look at Clara before springing into action. He scooped her up effortlessly in his arms, ignoring her protests that she could walk. "Call the hospital. Tell them we are inbound," David yelled to Margaret as he carried Clara toward the private elevator. The ride to Northwestern Memorial Hospital was a blur of excruciating pain and blinding panic. Clara gripped the leather armrest of the SUV, her breath coming in jagged, ragged gasps. Every contraction felt like a mountain crumbling inside her. The fear was paralyzing. She had lost 3 babies before this. She had fought too hard, endured too much betrayal, and waged an entire corporate war to protect this child. She could not lose him now. "Hang on, Clara," David urged, weaving the heavy vehicle through traffic with the siren blaring. "You're the strongest woman I know. Just breathe." As they pulled into the emergency bay, a team of nurses and doctors was already waiting. They rushed Clara onto a gurney, wheeling her frantically down the stark, brightly-lit corridors. The chaotic symphony of hospital monitors, shouting medical staff, and her own ragged breathing blurred together. "Blood pressure is spiking," a nurse yelled. "Fetal heart rate is decelerating. We need to move to the OR now." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping and rolling into her hairline. As the anesthesia mask was placed over her face, the last image that flashed in her mind wasn't the face of the husband who betrayed her, or the woman who sat in her chair. It was the blueprint of the life she was about to build, entirely on her own terms. She drifted to the darkness, ready to meet her son. The transition from darkness to light was agonizingly slow. Clara fought her way through the heavy, suffocating fog of anesthesia, her eyelids fluttering against the harsh, fluorescent glare of the hospital room. The first sensation that registered was a dull, throbbing ache radiating from her lower abdomen. The second was the rhythmic, steady beeping of a heart monitor. "Clara? Clara, can you hear me?" The voice was soft, laced with a rare, uncharacteristic tenderness. Clara turned her head, her vision swimming before finally focusing on the silver-haired woman sitting by her bedside. Margaret St. James looked entirely out of her element in the sterile, pale green hospital room, a designer blazer draped over a plastic chair, a cup of terrible cafeteria coffee in her hand. Standing stoically by the door, an immovable mountain of security, was David. "My baby," Clara rasped, her throat sandpaper dry. Panic, cold and sharp, immediately pierced through the painkillers. She tried to sit up, but the agonizing pull of her C-section incision forced her back down with a gasp. "Where is my son?" Margaret quickly stood, pressing a gentle hand to Clara's shoulder. "He's safe, Clara. He's in the neonatal intensive care unit. He was born at 4 pounds, 2 ounces. He's small, and his lungs need a little help, but the doctors say he is a fighter, just like his mother." Tears, hot and fast, spilled down Clara's cheeks. She let out a shuddering breath that felt like it carried the weight of the last 5 years. "He's alive. He is," Margaret smiled, a genuine, warm expression that her opposing counsel had never lived to see. "The nurses said, as soon as you can sit up in a wheelchair, David will take you to see him." "You did it, Clara." For the next 4 weeks, the world outside the sterilized walls of the NICU ceased to exist for Clara. She practically lived in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside her son's incubator. She named him Benjamin. Every day she watched his tiny chest rise and fall with the help of the respirator, her finger gently stroking his fragile, translucent hand. The empire, the millions of dollars, the betrayals, none of it mattered compared to the steady rhythm of Benjamin's heart monitor. But while Clara was nurturing life, Arthur was watching his own life completely disintegrate. Arthur's arraignment was a media circus. The downfall of Chicago's real estate golden boy was splashed across the front page of the Tribune. He was denied bail, deemed a flight risk due to his frantic, documented attempts to wire funds to the Cayman Islands. He traded his custom Italian wool suits for a scratchy, oversized orange jumpsuit. The trial itself was mercifully short, entirely because his co-conspirator had turned state's evidence. When Vanessa Kensington took the witness stand, the courtroom was packed. She wore a modest, high-necked navy blouse, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, looking every inch the naive, manipulated victim she and her lawyers had carefully curated. Under oath, with tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, Vanessa detailed every hidden transaction, every forged document, and every lie Arthur had fed her. She painted him as a predatory mastermind who used her as a blind pawn. Arthur sat at the defense table, his face buried in his hands. He realized too late that the woman he had thrown his wife away for was perfectly willing to feed him to the wolves to save her own skin. It took the jury less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts of corporate fraud, grand larceny, and embezzlement. The judge, an iron-fisted woman who had no patience for white-collar criminals, sentenced Arthur Sterling to 12 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole for 8. 6 months later, the brutal Chicago winter had melted away, giving birth to a crisp, brilliant spring. A sleek black town car pulled up to the glass-fronted skyscraper of what was formerly known as Sterling Enterprises. David stepped out of the driver's side, adjusting his suit jacket, and opened the rear door. Clara stepped out onto the pavement. She looked entirely transformed. The exhaustion and grief of the past year had been burned away, leaving behind something forged in titanium. She wore a sharp, tailored crimson power suit. Resting comfortably in a bespoke, ergonomic baby carrier strapped to her chest was Benjamin, wide-eyed and healthy, completely fascinated by the towering buildings. As Clara walked through the revolving doors, the lobby was silent, but not with tension. It was the silence of absolute respect. Employees parted like the Red Sea as she made her way to the VIP elevator. She rode up to the 45th floor executive suite. Beatrice, who Clara had graciously retained after realizing the assistant was terrified of losing her health insurance, stood up immediately. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," Beatrice said, deliberately using Clara's maiden name. "Good morning, Beatrice. Could you have Simon bring the rebranding portfolios into my office in 10 minutes? Clara asked smoothly. "Right away, ma'am." Clara walked down the corridor and pushed open the heavy oak doors to her office. The room was unrecognizable. The old auction-bought mahogany desk was gone. The heavy masculine decor Arthur had favored had been completely stripped away. In its place was a stunning, minimalist space filled with natural light, modern glass architecture, and lush green indoor plants. And right in the center of the room sat a brand-new, flawlessly crafted white leather executive chair. Clara unclipped Benjamin from his carrier, gently settling him into a luxurious bassinet tucked safely in the corner of the room. She walked around the glass desk and ran her hand over the smooth leather of the new chair. She sat down, spinning it slowly, taking in the panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from Margaret. Attached was a scanned document, the final, notarized divorce decree. At the bottom, Arthur's signature was scrawled, messy and rushed, signed with a cheap plastic pen in the visiting room of a federal prison in Marion, Illinois. Clara had gone to see him just once, to deliver the papers herself. They had spoken through thick, reinforced plexiglass. Arthur had looked hollowed out, his California tan replaced by a sickly fluorescent pallor. He had pressed his hand against the glass, crying, begging for forgiveness, begging for a single photograph of his son. Clara had looked at him without an ounce of pity. "You burned down your own house, Arthur," she had told him, her voice perfectly steady through the crackling prison phone. "You don't get to ask to see the garden that grew from the ashes." She had hung up the phone, turned her back on him, and walked out without ever looking over her shoulder. Sitting in her beautiful sunlit office, Clara looked at the signature on the screen, closed the laptop, and took a deep breath. The company was hers. Her son was healthy. The slate was wiped entirely clean. There was a soft knock on the door, and Simon stepped in, carrying a stack of files bearing a sleek, modern new logo. "The board is assembled in the conference room, Clara," Simon said, a proud smile touching his lips. "They are ready for the official unveiling of Hayes Architectural." Clara stood up, buttoning her crimson blazer. She walked over to the bassinet, pressing a soft kiss to Benjamin's forehead. He cooed, reaching up a tiny hand. "I'm ready," Clara said, her eyes flashing with the brilliance of a woman who had survived the fire and learned how to control the flames. She walked out of her office, leaving the door wide open behind. She didn't need to lock it anymore. No one would ever dare sit in her chair again. What an absolutely epic conclusion. Clara proved that you should never underestimate a woman who built her own empire from the ground up. From catching Vanessa in her custom chair to completely dismantling Arthur's life and putting him behind bars, Clara's revenge was a strategic masterpiece. Arthur's greed and betrayal cost him everything: his wealth, his freedom, and his family. While Clara rose from the ashes as the sole CEO of Hayes Architectural, stronger and more powerful than ever. What did you think of Clara's ultimate revenge? Did Arthur get exactly what he deserved? Or was his 12-year prison sentence too harsh? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves a good comeback story, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable, dramatic, real-life stories. See you in the next video.